So welcome back to You Must Be Woking, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion. In today's episode, we're exploring the topic of inclusive language, a topic I'm sure you'll agree is very emotive at the moment. It's causing lots of stir in the newspapers and in the press and in society at large. And we explore how employers or leaders of organizations can navigate the pitfalls that come with inclusive language, or whether or not you should just introduce a language guide or not. Hey, welcome back, Dawn.
Welcome.
How you doing?
I'm really good, actually. Yeah, really good.
In this episode, we're going to talk about inclusive language, probably one of my favorite topics.
Oh, we're going to be here for 3 weeks then.
I will try and contain myself. But inclusive language is clearly a very emotive topic, right? It sparks lots of debates, particularly in the last few years. We've seen quite a lot of debate about language as in general. And dare I say, I would even go as far as say some companies are fearful of this topic. Would you agree?
Fearful, at least, indeed.
Okay. So hopefully by the end of this episode, as a leader in business, you'll have a little bit of a better understanding on how to navigate the pitfalls that come with modern day inclusive language. But until then, shall we catch up?
Yeah. How's your week going?
Yeah. I've been good. My week's been good. It's I was just telling a friend a few minutes ago that I've been learning all about archiving this week. How exciting is that? And it's actually a really interesting topic. So one of my clients was telling me about the work that they do in archiving, government records, those kind of things. So it's been a fascinating week for me. I'm learning loads.
Oh, that's different.
Yeah, it's exciting. And Jakey's doing well at school. He's getting on all right. All good. Keeps coming home, bounding home every day. High school's amazing. He's learned how to use his thumbprint, so he buys everything in the canteen that he can possibly buy. But yeah, all good.
Oh,
what about you? What's going on for you?
Yeah, busy work week. Did some really interesting stuff around inclusive travel today, which was cool, both in terms of air travel and resorts and locations and things. And personally, yeah, all good. Heading home today for the first time this week.
No, nice. You've been away a lot then, yeah?
Yeah, been away all week.
Trucking your bag through hotels.
Absolutely. Have bag, will travel.
Planes, trains and automobiles and all that good stuff. And joys of being a consultant, right?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Well, should we get into it? Should we get into the main topic today? So today's topic, as we've said, is about inclusive language. And I always like to start with a good old news article on the topic. So today's one, which is quite interesting, the British Red Cross has come under fire for its controversial inclusive language guide, advising its employees to avoid using the term maiden name. So you're not allowed to say maiden name anymore, apparently. The charity, which counts King Charles as its patron, is said to have circulated a 12-page dossier to staff this summer detailing acceptable language they can use. Staff were reportedly told to avoid terms such as ladies and gentlemen, maiden name, because they're not inclusive, and descriptions such as born a man or woman and biological male or female are said to have been banned in the organisation. The pamphlet is also reported to have told staff that people who are not women can get pregnant and have periods, and employees were advised to say women, girls, and people who menstruate, or people who have periods, rather than solely referring to women. I'm going straight to you. Unpick that for us. Unpack what's going on.
Wow. Okay. I'm being flagged. I've got 2 minutes. So we started with fear. I mean, if we're just trying to embed fear, let's keep doing that stuff because that's really helpful. The fact it's only 16 pages, I think you said, is encouraging because I have seen one that's 90.
Yeah. Didn't Oxfam do one last year?
It was Oxfam, yeah. I think it was something like 95 pages. Yeah. We don't make people's lives easy by doing this stuff. And sadly, unfortunately, we push the topic backwards because it becomes a subject of ridicule. Yeah. And whilst, I support the sentiment of a lot of what you're talking about there, and there's a way to be inclusive without taking this to the nth degree.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really challenging, isn't it? And I guess we should be honest here. So we have lots of clients in our work that we do where they ask us, should we be issuing language guides and doing things similar to this, right? And we understand, I guess, maybe we'll cover off why they think these things, but our advice is always no, right?
Absolutely.
And I guess part of the reason we say no to clients is because they're going to be out of date in about 4.5 seconds, right? So the minute you print them, they're effectively out of date. And part of the reason for that is because society and language is moving so much faster than legislation or corporations can keep up. It's a pointless exercise, right?
We were talking just before we came on air in terms of, the Court of Justice today has released 2 precedents within about 2 hours of each other. That's how quick these things are changing. And you couldn't possibly, no matter how much information you can retain, keep up to date with it.
Yeah. I guess, I mentioned on a previous episode, I think my memory serves me correct, about one of my CEO clients who called me and basically wanted me to help them with language and to navigate the language. And I guess that these kind of things, these language guides, they feed into that narrative, don't they, around cancel culture. Get it wrong and you get cancelled, say it wrong and you're out, or, over policing this topic. And that's the bit that worries me too much about language. When did we lose the art of saying, hold on, what did you just say? You can't say that, and move on, right? And just accept that we pull somebody off and, whatever, but move on. And if you make a mistake, say sorry and move on. Like, when did we get to a place where we over police this stuff?
I have huge sympathy for organisations because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't.
Yeah,
so I do understand where the motivation to produce a guide comes from, and it may be pressure. And if somebody is responsible for producing the guide who maybe doesn't have the robustness or doesn't have the understanding broadly of the topic, I totally get it. And I really feel compassion for those individuals. But that investment would be far better spent on embedding a few basic principles into an organisation and educating the business really simply on some principles of what inclusive language means.
No, I totally agree with that. And I guess we have to take a step back to understand, why are people doing these kind of things? And I guess for me, some of that comes back to, there are some real important reasons why language has evolved over the last, I want to say 5 years, but it's more like 50 years, right?
Absolutely.
Language has changed so much in the last 50 years. And I think, again, I mentioned on a previous episode, language that even my family members were using, which was totally inappropriate, right? We're relating to LGBT or whatever, right? But times change, we evolve, and things move. So I think it's difficult for organizations to navigate some of that kind of, language evolution and how that kind of changes. And if it's difficult for organizations, it's certainly difficult for individuals. But I guess part of the problem, and what we say on this podcast is we're going to have honest conversations and sometimes tough conversations. Our industry have taken it too far, right? So I hear the phrase political correctness gone mad on a daily basis, right? Because that's what people think about this. And you can call it political correctness, or you can call it D&I gone mad, or you can call it, diversity police, whatever you want to call it, right? But, there is a point to some of that, right? And I was trying to think back to what points in time did I hear things and think, where did that come from, right? So I think my favorite one was when I was told by my partner at the time, actually, you can't call the bin men anymore, right? You have to call them waste disposal management technicians, right? Which literally made me howl with laughter, because I'm like, hold on, say what now? We have to call them waste disposal management technician. I mean, who's ever going to say, hold on, I'm just going to put the bins out for the waste disposal management technicians are coming in. Like, it's never going to happen, is it? And I guess that sentiment brings ridicule to what is actually an important topic, because it isn't just men anymore doing the bins, right? There are females that do that. So rather than, going to this extreme end of waste disposal management technicians, why don't we just say the bin collector, right? Why didn't we just do that?
But I think, again, we just make life too complicated for ourselves. There are two cards we need. There's the one that says, I'm curious. Yeah. The one that says, sorry, how do I? What do I? What does that mean? And the mistake card that goes, I got that wrong.
Sorry about that.
How many times do I hear the boards I work with go, the chairman will the chairwoman. And then we draw even more attention to the actual issue than if we just relax into this and go, right, I'm clear what we need to be saying.
Yeah.
And those two simple adjustments make such a big difference.
Well, they do, but the problem is that's not where people are going with this topic. And so that's I guess the point that I'm making here around these language guides. They bring sometimes ridicule to the topic. We heard some things in here which make people get really cross, where you say, things like
maiden name.
Yeah, maiden name. Like it's a bit strange. Or people who menstruate, right? Like, that's emotive. That's going to upset people. Why are we leaning into that stuff when we didn't need to? Actually, is it really important that we address people in that way? Why can't we just address people as individuals and talk about them as by their name, or lean into that kind of person-centered language as opposed to their difference? I don't understand why we're overcomplicating language.
I think people are fascinated with language if we take it back to its raw sense. There's a lot of history in language, and a lot of the language we use today dates back 500-600 years in origin. And therefore, there are multiple meanings to everything we say. So using something like maiden name, which will have come from Tudor period, no doubt, we start and realise that perhaps we don't feel that's appropriate. But we don't have to turn this into political correctness. We just need to offer an alternative or some rules around how we make that different.
We just navigate language in a slightly different way. Yeah, it makes total sense. Talking about dating well back, right? I got quite exercised about this one. Bar black sheep.
Oh.
You're not allowed to say it anymore, right? Because it's insensitive, or it's not inclusive, or whatever this is, right? So I got the bit between my teeth with this because, it's a nursery rhyme. I have children and all that good stuff. So I got one of our team to do some research to find out whether bar black sheep had any kind of connotations to the slave trade or to inappropriate language. And do you know what? It turns out that bar black sheep is just a bloody sheep. There's no connotations whatsoever to this stuff, right? So I do think there's an element of society that is over-policing this stuff, trying to find fault in any bit of language. And sometimes a sheep's just a bloody sheep.
Yeah, exactly that. That should be the name of the episode. A sheep's just a sheep.
Sheep's just a bloody sheep. Love that. So I do think there are some other things, though, that we need to think about in language, because it is quite an emotive topic. And so if you obviously you know this, but some of our listeners may not have heard this term, but the term heteronormative assumptions, right?
Yeah.
And I have to be honest, when I first heard that, going back about 8 years ago, I had to Google and try and understand, what does this mean, heteronormative assumptions? But actually, when I've now understood it, it makes total sense to me, right? So, we're policing people by saying, we shouldn't make heteronormative assumptions. And, what we should say is actually, we've got to simplify the language that we use, because what that essentially means for leaders, or for those listeners that don't understand what it means, is when somebody says to a partner, Dawn, what's your husband do? And then Dawn has to say, actually, I don't have a husband. I have a wife. I mean, she doesn't, by the way, but she might do. That
Don't
I
have
don't
any
know
of
about.
those things.
But we make the assumption that because you're a woman that you have a husband rather than maybe a female partner, and it's those heteronormative assumptions we make. And when I thought about this in a bit more detail, I've thought about me, right? And I link it to every time I go for a haircut, I have to come out. Right? I literally have to go through the process of coming out every time I go for a haircut. So 2 reasons for that. Firstly, because I'm not organized enough to use the same hairdresser all the time. So I'm always last minute and therefore I have to just take whatever's going. But the second is because every hairdresser I have or barber that I use are using heteronormative assumptions because they assume that when I say, oh, I'm doing X at the weekend, or I talk about my son, that I must have a wife. And then I have to say, oh no, I'm gay. And they go, oh, right, that's okay. And then I say, I know, right? Because it's quite funny. But actually, when you think about it, for people who had a traumatic experience coming out, that can be really annoying when you have to do that every time you meet somebody new or every time. And I guess those heteronormative assumptions on language are difficult, aren't they, right?
Absolutely that. And, we could take that to the next level of where we've created a whole new language to avoid heteronormative language. I think about things like mansplaining as an example, which is a favourite term I hear loads, particularly in traditional sectors. And, there's multiple words that...
But we hear from individuals in organizations that we work with where they say, oh, well, I better not say anything because I'll be accused of mansplaining, right? As opposed to, well, actually, it's not about that. What we're saying is you're not giving people enough space to speak, right? And therefore you need to hear as well as speak. And again, I think that comes back down to a bit of education for people. But if you over-police it, you just turn people off and they go, oh, well, I won't speak then.
Exactly that. And that's the sentiment of this whole wide topic is remove this fear. Stop putting barriers in people's way and rules that make people fearful.
Yeah. So I've got two more things I want to say on a couple of examples for our listeners to hear. So the first one is queer. Right. And this is because clearly it's important to me. But the word queer is actually a really derogative term for somebody of my age group. So when I was growing up, if I heard the word queer, it was a derogatory term, right? And actually, it's still, when I hear it now, it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up on end a bit, right? And I'm always a bit frosty about it. But actually, particularly here in the UK, the younger generation, the younger LGBT generation have reclaimed the word queer, right? And they're really proud of it. So they openly talk about, oh, I'm queer, or where, my queer community, that kind of stuff. And part of me is really proud that they've taken that word and said, no longer are we going to allow it to be a derogatory term and we're going to re-own it and reclaim it and all of that good stuff. But equally, so part of me also thinks, but for people my age and maybe older, that was a really derogatory term. So we have to be careful with even that language that we use and the differences between the generations and the language they use, right?
Absolutely. And if you took that to all sorts of different characteristics, let's talk about mental health for a second. Oh, you're nuts.
Yeah.
And, they are basic comments that I hear every day. Yeah. But if we were going to take it to the root of the guide, that would be inappropriate, of course. The same with race or religion or belief or all of those descriptors that we use or language we use.
And by over-policing some of this stuff, all we're doing actually is excluding people rather than including people. And I'm not suggesting we should have a free-for-all in organizations. There is a better way to deal with this, and maybe we'll come on to how organizations and leaders can try and navigate this topic in a little bit better. But I guess there's also a part of me that gets a bit frustrated with some organizations or some people in our space who are, maybe it's the cynic in me coming through again, but they use this for their own kind of ends and means, or they play into this language being political correctness and stuff for their means. So again, there was an article in the papers, I want to say about a year ago, I can't remember the exact date, so apologies if I'm getting that wrong, but from a national airline in this country who made the announcement to the press that they were no longer going to say, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," on their flights, right? And it caused this big stink. And you can imagine the papers like Daily Mail and the others saying, complete wokery gone mad and all of this kind of good stuff. The cynic in me says they did that deliberately for a marketing ploy, right? They were trying to play into any news is good news, right? Any advertising is good advertising. But because even if they were going to make that change, they could have just changed the scripts and sent it out to their internal teams and said, from Monday, the new script is, "Good morning, everybody. Welcome on board our flight to whatever," right? They wouldn't have even had to talk about ladies and gentlemen. They could have just tweaked the language in the slightest possible terms and said, "Good morning, everybody. Welcome on board, blah, blah, blah." And they didn't. Instead, what they made a big thing of was making a press release to say, "We're no longer going to say ladies and gentlemen." And so I don't know. What do you think? Am I being overly sensitive about the cynic in me?
I think there was some commercial benefit for them doing that. I actually think that change of language feels really comfortable for me. I would much rather say, "Hi, everybody," than have to list 17 different categories of person. And I think that's a simple common sense change. I don't think the publicity surrounding it is. And I know we're not covering pronouns on this episode.
No, that's a whole
episode. New topic. But, there's been examples within the world of pronouns that have done the same. Yeah. And again, any publicity is good publicity, allegedly, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just me being cynical. Who knows? So I have a question for you, because I think it's really important that we help our listeners with this, right? Because if I'm being really honest, I think there is a huge amount of complexity and confusion to this topic. But I think we should try and explain to people the difference between sex, gender, and gender identity. And I'm throwing it to you to answer that question.
I anticipated your question. But I have to say, this is immensely complex.
Yeah.
And I find it complex, and I've worked in this space for 20 odd years. So complex, in fact, that because this topic is still being debated in the Royal Courts of Justice, I have got the latest guidance in front of me. However, I should warn our listeners, of course, that there is much confusion around this and that this is changing rapidly.
Yeah, it's not just confusion though either, is it? Right? There's heated debate about this stuff, and whether that's in the workplace, whether it's in society, whether it's in on TV, whether it's in Parliament, in countries around the world. This is a hotly contested topic, isn't it? So here's our warning to everybody that's listening, right? Yeah. As much as Dawn's I'm throwing it to you to give us the kind of descriptor here. Please bear in mind that this topic is evolving and changing and is hugely contested by lots of different factions of society and different groups for different reasons in obvious ways. But actually, we'll give you a rough guide. Is that fair? We'll give you a rough guide of what we mean by these different things. Well, I won't. Dawn's going to do that.
As at today, she says, stressing. So the first thing to think about is some basic definitions. And it's really important that we think about those definitions in terms of the most common. So we'll start with sex and then we'll come on to gender. Yeah. But there's currently, as you quite rightly say, not only debates in terms of the definition of sex, for example, but the whole topic as we go even further into this, where we start to introduce words like intersex, for example, are still being debated in the courts of justice. So let's get into the very basics. And the confusion starts really between the difference between sex and gender and is often interchanged. I hear that interchanged a lot, whether that be in networks or silos, for example. But they're two very different concepts. So let's start first of all with sex. And this is defined as the biological sex, or indeed the characteristics such as our primary genitalia, or indeed our reproductive functions.
Yeah.
So this is hopefully quite clear in terms of sex. However, gender is the societal and cultural constructs. So how we identify ourselves and how others identify us. So if we go into more depth, and this is where I'm going to refer to the very latest guidance, is that sex is usually assigned or determined or recorded at the point of birth. And it's based, as we've said, primarily on genitalia or our reproductive functions. And in 99.5% of cases, it's very clear which sex and which genitalia an individual is born with.
And this is where people say man has a penis and a woman has a vagina, right? Because it's really, in its most simplest terms, that's what we're talking about when we talk about sex.
Exactly that. And so we understand that 99.95% of individuals, it's clearly determinable. However, we do need to be mindful that some people are born with differences in sex development, which is abbreviated to DSD. And it can be referred to as intersex. Now, what this often means is that the sexual development is different. And it can be that an individual could either be born visibly with a difference or internally with a difference or with multiple genitalia.
Okay.
So it's important that we understand that is effectively a third determination in this definition.
Okay.
Now, in most countries, doctors will assign the sex of a baby at birth. But in Germany, for example, they have identified a third sex as intersex.
Okay. So they actually call it intersex in Germany. Yeah.
Absolutely that. But again, this is where we start to get into the realms of contention, because even when we talk about the fact that a sex can change through surgical intervention, we know that biologists in some areas say that it can't. And this is really at the core of the debate. So if we bring this back to things like sport, or we bring this back into competition, we start to see the complexity of this.
Yeah. And that is quite a contested thing, particularly here in the UK at the moment. And I guess in a lot of Western countries in particular, people are debating these facts. And sport's probably the obvious one because, you know, where you're talking about hormone development, growth, and the difference between male and female hormones and chromosomes and all of that good stuff, there are clear, distinct differences. So when people then enter the debate about what happens if somebody changes sex at a certain point, do they lose all of those differences? The answer, according to biologists, is pretty much no, and therefore this is where the debate kind of heats up, right? Sport's the most obvious one for that heated debate, but there are other things that cause debate.
Absolutely that. And so we introduced terms like gender reassignment into the mix. And then we recognise that within the UK and some other countries that gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. But then we come back to the debate around language. Yeah. And we start to recognise that in the UK, for example, individuals who have transitioned can be legally recognised through the use of a gender recognition certificate. Again, another key term.
Sorry to interrupt. So can they, when that happens, so I've got myself a gender recognition certificate, does that mean I can consider myself a different sex or a different gender?
So it means that I can legally change my sex.
Right.
Okay.
So on my passport, for example.
Absolutely that. And it's worth noting that not all trans people will apply for that certificate, because that's an important point. It's not necessary for the gender markers, for example, in the workplace, to have that certificate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. With me so far?
I'm holding on. Go, keep going. You're doing well.
So, moving on from sex, and again bearing in mind that these terms are often interchanged, we then need to move on to gender and gender identity. And gender is often expressed in terms of things like masculinity, femininity, and is largely culturally determined. I might wear a dress, you might wear a suit, those kinds of things. But that can change over time. And what we need to be mindful of is that gender, again, is often assumed from birth. So if I was to wear a pink dress, you would assume I am female, for example. So gender identity is how I identify myself.
Okay. So it's not me assuming you're female, it's what you believe you are.
It's what I believe.
Okay.
And this is important because when we explore it in more detail, and I'm talking about how I deeply feel an identity, or I have my own sense of identity, that is how I would perceive my gender identity. Not what you think or what society or culture thinks. It's my identity.
Yeah, and not even what a bit of paper thinks, right, either.
Exactly that. I don't need a certificate to give me a gender identity. So we often hear terms like non-binary. And this is an umbrella term that is used around gender identity that doesn't sit comfortably with female or male, for example. So again, we need to be mindful of these intricacies of this topic, coveted by the fact that this is still an active and live debate. And despite having been through the Supreme Court and is now with the Royal Courts of Justice, these topics around intersex, gender identity, sex are still fluid in terms of discussion and language.
And they are genuinely hotly contested. So we can't go into this today for obvious reasons because we just would run out of time. But, this is this kind of heated debate in particular is kicked off in the UK in the Scottish Parliament, where they tried to make changes to legislation and the UK government blocked them around gender and gender identity and sex, this kind of stuff. And I guess we should recognise, for me, I feel like we should recognize why this is a particularly hot topic for people, right? So as you were talking there about somebody's internal sense of identity, right? Their gender identity is internal to them and how they feel about that. I had this wave of emotion come through me that felt like, I have a huge amount of sympathy for those individuals who are going through something that's really internal for them, is probably really defining for them and their own sense of purpose and identity in the world. And to have that sense of identity contested in the public realm can be really difficult for those individuals. I would imagine, I'm speaking on behalf of them, but I can imagine that can be really difficult for them. But on the flip side to that, I also have a lot of sympathy for individuals who are saying that actually we need to be mindful in public spaces, in schools, in sport, in buildings where women in particular have fought long, hard fights to have protected spaces and rights that are for women specifically, who are feeling like, actually, we haven't got this right yet. And whatever the debates on either side, I guess where I feel, I do feel like a bystander to this, right? Yeah. And I want to sympathize with both sides of the debate, because actually I can see the arguments on both sides of this debate about, particularly in the language we use as well. But I guess I feel this sense of we can't stop having the debate. We just need to have it in a more sensible way, right? Because if people had stopped having the debate about sexuality and gay rights back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I wouldn't be living the life I lead today.
Precisely.
So there feels like something in me that says, I can see the debate on both sides, but I just want to take the heat out of it, because actually, if we continue to have really good conversations, I have every faith in humanity and society that we'll find some answers for this stuff. But not if we create this heat that exists at the moment, where if you say one thing, you're cancelled. If you say another thing, you're cancelled. Like that can't exist, right? And in particular in the workplace, we need to be really mindful of this, because we can't solve the societal issue at work, but we've got to be mindful that that societal issue exists, right?
Exactly that. And I think, you hit the nail on the head in terms of we need to keep this as simple for everybody.
Yeah.
Whether that be an identity, whether that be an understanding, whether that be language. And I think often the vast majority of people want to simply understand.
Yeah.
And therefore, our job as practitioners is to make this as simple as possible. And if we struggle to get it right, of course, the average individual will.
Okay. So to simplify that, sex, usually assigned at birth, male, female. There is a slight difference in the DSD, I think you said it was,
Exactly.
in terms of the intersex. That's different in different countries and is still being, debated and contested, and probably will go on for quite some time. Gender is usually what society associates with your
Pink
gender
dress.
to be. Pink dress, blue dress, whatever. And then gender identity is about someone's internal sense of who they are and how they feel and how they believe. Right. Okay, good. So all of that's quite complicated because it's still being challenged in the courts around the world and is still debated hotly. Our advice to everybody is chill out a little bit, take the heat out, continue the conversation. We'll find answers and we'll find solutions if we do that. But are we saying, because there are lots of other identities that come under gender identity, right? And I think the last count, we were up at about, I don't know, however many.
Gone over 100.
Yeah, so an enormous amount. What does that mean for leaders then? Are we saying they need to get themselves a little dictionary that says, you need to know all of this, you need to know how to respond and know all of these different identities?
The dictionary will be out of date tomorrow if we issue any kind of dictionary. So some basic techniques. The first is to simply be curious, to say, can I ask you some questions? I don't understand. May I ask for some clarity? As we get to know our colleagues, and to be comfortable to tolerate.
Yeah.
Remember, we don't have to accept, we have to tolerate difference. So if somebody wants to identify in a particular way, our job as leaders is to be tolerant of that and reasonable in our adjustments.
I can hear all of our listeners going, no need for a dictionary.
No need for a dictionary.
Excellent. So I have a couple more questions that I want to kind of put to you. So apologies, I'm putting you on the spot today, but hopefully you're on a roll. So I'm just going to keep going with it. What about things like religion, right? So how does language play into religion? I mean, it's a protected characteristic. It's something that organizations and leaders do need to take seriously within their organization. How do you recommend people navigate some of those kind of differences in religion? Because even things like, on our forms in an organization, we're asking people to give their first name, last name, or Christian name, whatever, that kind of stuff. And it can come under challenge, right? Everything seems to be under challenge at the moment. So how do we navigate that?
I come back to the advice around simplicity. Undoubtedly, because the world's moving so quickly, organisations are going to have to change the basic stuff like form filling and categorisation. Otherwise, every drop-down box is going to have 300 different options on it, and that's just not practical. Yeah. We're going to have to adapt into simple things like text boxes. And that will do away with all of this need for maiden name and sire name and all of these different ways that we articulate ourselves with names. The simplest way is to make that free flow so that the individuals can use that in the way they choose.
And do you know what? That's a little bit harder to try and decipher that data or sort that data, but do you know what? It's worth it, isn't it? It's worth it rather than being too prescriptive.
AI makes that immediately easy for you.
I guess part of the reason this is important is because it's about identity. And we often think about identity as about somebody's gender or their sex, right? That's what seems to be the hot topic about identity. But it isn't true, is it? Identity is actually much wider than that. So I'm a Welshman, right? And people in Wales get very passionate about the fact that they are Welsh, not British, right? And they're exploring that identity, even though a larger proportion of individuals speak English than they do Welsh. They consider themselves Welsh. Now, I personally, I am a British Welshman or a Welsh British. I don't really have a preference. But other individuals within Wales are Welsh, only Welsh, or other individuals are Welsh British. The same can be said in Scotland. The same can be said in Northern Ireland and different parts of the UK. I've got family in Cornwall who are, all about being Cornish and all of that kind of stuff. But that plays into this theme about identity, and therefore the language you use around those identities is really important. I know people in Wales get really offended when they go on holiday and people go, "Where are you from?" And they say, "Oh, I'm from Swansea in Wales," or whatever. And they go, "Oh, is that in England?" And they go, "No, it's in Wales." And people get really offended by that. And again, there's not usually any malice in that. It's people just assume that the UK is England, right? But identity is massive. And I think people in general are starting to explore identity like they've never really explored it before. And that's playing into language. And therefore, because people are quite passionate about their identity in different ways, they get quite passionate about the language that gets used about the identity. So I come back to those holiday makers who get really offended when people say you're English. There's no malice in somebody being called English. But for a Welsh person who's very passionate about not being English, that is offensive.
Absolutely. And this is where we need to have a little bit of tolerance on that first occasion. Because, that is a very genuine mistake in the vast majority of cases. If we repeat that mistake, absolutely identity becomes a much bigger issue for people because we're being disrespectful. But again, back to, tell me more. If I'm based in the US, I may not understand the difference between England and Wales, for example.
Yeah, 100%. And again, that's about that kind of education piece. But equally, the same principle, language, applies with race.
Yes.
Right? So we've seen, even here in the UK, the terms we use to, I hate to say this, but sort data on this topic has come under a lot of challenge in recent years. COVID was a good example of that, where, we were lumping ethnic minority groups together, and actually their differences or their reactions to COVID was very different. And therefore, those communities started saying, will you stop lumping us together? Because we're being affected in really different ways. But as a society, we were lumping them all into minority ethnic or ethnic minority. And so that in itself, as language has changed or is in the process of changing. In the US, they use people of color or Chinese American or whatever the terminologies are for these different kind of segments. But even those kind of identities are, and the language associated with them, are coming under much more scrutiny. And organizations are under that kind of pressure. Oh God, I'm going to have, to your point, 100 things on my drop-down list before long, right?
And I think, again, people are fearful of even what you've just said. Because the reality is, again, the vast majority of people couldn't name you every different permutation of what that looks like. So when they're meeting a new person, they're terrified of asking the wrong question. And we've got to remove that fear. Tell me, I'd like to ask you a few questions to get to know you a little bit more. Are you comfortable with that? Yes, great. So can you help me pronounce your name? Can you tell me how you identify?
Be more curious.
Be more curious.
And I think there's maybe I'll cover it a little bit later, but I think there's a responsibility on employers to do something here to help people navigate that stuff, right? So with that in mind, let's get into the so what then, right? Let's do the so what? Who cares, right? We've heard all of this stuff about language and how challenging it is and how language guides are a bit pointless. They need to be, binned off. What should employers do instead then to try and navigate this topic? Because it is difficult.
It is difficult, but I would introduce some real basic principles first and foremost. I would hope that employers are embedding a culture of respect anyway. So if every item on language comes from a place of respect, and that we give people that agreement that they can make one mistake and that they will be actively curious, we then need to put some simple guidelines in place.
Can we make it two mistakes? So the reason I'm saying two mistakes is because somebody picked me up once at a client office and said, can you stop saying guys? Right? And some people might think that's a bit ridiculous, right? But actually, it's an important point. There were lots of women in the room and I was using the term guys. But actually, habits are hard to change. And even for me, who I consider myself fairly inclusive, right, given the work that I do, but even for me, that simple change, I definitely made it again, even after I was corrected. So maybe we go 2 times.
We'll go to. And to be frank, if you've got some good colleagues, they should be tapping you back in a light-hearted way to bring it back in line. But we overuse words when we talk.
Yeah.
We don't need to be talking about the fact I'm going to a gay wedding. I'm going to a wedding in the same way as I'm going to any wedding. I don't need to be identified as the female CEO. I'm just a CEO, exactly the same as every other CEO. And we add all of these descriptors in that actually we don't need. So that would be my first piece of advice. Keep your language really simple and specific.
Sorry, you just made me think about something which I have to share because it is quite funny. So my friends come in to visit me in Cardiff, Kev and Chris, and I call them the gays, right? So the gays are coming at the weekend, Jacob, right? And so Jacob's in school and says to his teachers, the gays are coming this weekend. To which the teachers say, Jacob, I'm sure they have names. And he goes, yeah, the gays. Kev and Chris, the gays. And then I say to the teacher afterwards, I'm so sorry, that's me. I've done that. I call them the gays and, whatever. But he's being then corrected to school. But that's me passing that on to him, right? And so, I need to also a bit guilty of not using people's names when it's relevant as opposed to nicknaming them. The gays are coming the weekend.
But we do that, don't we? We do in language. I sadly have a friend who has recently been diagnosed with cancer. And when a group of us were talking about, that sad situation, there were so many people who used things like suffers and fighting. She'll be fighting cancer. And what she said was, no, I'm not fighting anything because there's a winner and a loser in a fight. And I am only going one way with this. And again, we need to just be mindful of how we use it, don't we? So coming back to the guidance and the so what, we're going to play the mistake card. We're going to play the curious card. We're going to have the guidelines in place that says we keep our language simple and we only use the words we actually need to have. And we keep our language people-centered. So we're not going to use terms like the gays. We're going to either use their names or describe more appropriately.
It's so true. We see it in the press as well. The gay politician said, or the female politician. Is it really relevant that we're using that terminology? No, it's just the politician, right? Unless it's about a gay topic, and then I guess you want to make the reference. But but we see it a lot in organisations. The female engineer, don't we? They're making this big thing that they finally have a female engineer.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think there's a bit about employers taking responsibility for this stuff as well, and there is a duty on us to help our employees navigate this stuff, right? We're in an ever-changing world. The world is evolving. Language is evolving. And instead of doing a language guide, teach them how to navigate this stuff. So using your framework of using person-centered language and all of that stuff, that's the stuff we should be doing as an employer. Do you remember the story about the Queen's lady in waiting saying something to a charity worker at an event at the palace where she said, "Where are you from?" Or she moved her hair to look at her name badge and then said, "Where are you from?" And this person said, "Oh, I'm from this charity." And she said, "No, where are you really from?" And she said, "Oh, well, we're based in Hackney." And this woman said, "No, where in Africa are you from?" Right? And so clearly that's not helpful. That's not where we want to be as an organization or as a society, right? And it was clumsy, it was outdated language and all of that good stuff. And I saw in the press afterwards, there was lots of debate about this. Did the individual from the charity goad her? Were we being a bit mean because she was old or whatever? You know, she was an older person. And it doesn't really matter for me, right? Because none of that actually matters. It happened, it got reported, but the palace had been warned about this, right? Because however long before, 6 months, 12 months, Meghan Markle had said something to the press, and it had been in the press, that people in the palace were using inappropriate racist language. And the palace came out and apologized and said, "Oh, I'm really sorry if Meghan feels this way and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to put these policies in place and all of that kind of stuff." And yet here we are then 8 months later, and this individual who, whether we like it or not, is an employee of this institution, is now using that language. And my question is, what did the organization do other than put a policy in place to help that individual, that lady, understand that what she was doing there would have been really inappropriate? And if they haven't done anything, then that's on them. And that's the responsibility of the organization.
Which I think brings us full circle to where we started, doesn't it? Because some organisations have seen that challenge and gone, "I know what we'll do.
We'll do a language guide.
We'll give you a dictionary of what you can and can't say." And, you know, that is equally as clumsy, and it's not sustainable, because if you compare that to 3 or 4 basic principles that you can apply every day, it's much easier for the average person to remember. I know my father and my grandparents would use language literally 20 years ago that we would be horrified by today, and they would punctuate it into day-to-day language. And we still have those generational differences in the workplace. So again, we need to respectfully support individuals with these principles, because if that has been your language, we need to just tap it back into this millennium
and not over police it, so that you know, we've got an army of diversity police running around our organizations telling everybody off for saying this wrong or that wrong. Actually just create an environment where people can say, "Do you know what, you really shouldn't have said that or use that language," and people can say, "Oh, I'm really sorry," and move on, right?
And ask the question, you know, what should I say?
I love that, actually, because, and we always say this to organizations, if you can't give them the correction, don't bother correcting them. Right? Because if you can't tell them what to use instead, then you shouldn't be pulling them up in the first place, because that's quite important, isn't it?
Massively.
Because if they don't know, then they're still not going to know even after you've told them off. In which case, what's the point, right?
And don't do that in a patronising way, would be my advice. You know, the reality is we're not here to wag fingers and police people. We're here to gently coax them into moving forward.
Okay, so you heard it here on You Must Be Woking. They're your top tips. Get your teams to understand a framework rather than giving them a language guide. Get them to understand the kind of do's and don'ts of how to navigate this topic. And if people make mistakes, accept that people will make mistakes and they can apologize and move on. And we shouldn't be over-policing this stuff. Top tips. Heard it from us.
Absolutely.
I love it. Okay. So I think we're at the point, Dawn, where we are going to hand over the microphone to our listeners and see what questions we've got. So the fabulous Evan, I believe, has been collating our questions. So we'll call him in with our envelope. And just to remind listeners, this is the point in the show where Evan comes in, gives us a sealed envelope where our listeners have sent him questions that we have no idea. Thank you, Evan. We have no idea what they've asked us. and this is the first time we get to see it. So I get to ask the question. So you're the one that gets put on the spot every week. Maybe next time Evan can give you the envelope. How should organizations stay updated in adopting new language or phasing out old language? That's a really good question, actually. How do we keep abreast of things that change? Because they will change inevitably.
Absolutely. My advice is to sign up to some news channels or some legal updates that will help you with the big stuff. But again, the principles apply in exactly the same way as language evolves. And to relax around this topic. And the more relaxed we are and the more curious we are, it will adapt naturally.
Yeah. So the next question is an interesting one, but I'm really keen to play this out. So it says, what should be the consequences for an employee who is intentionally not using inclusive language? So that's a really interesting one, isn't it?
It's
because
good.
You can do the education, you can give them the framework, but if they still don't, so what?
But we cross a line here. Because we cross a line from lack of education or even ignorance or lack of knowledge into a choice, because that's a behavioural choice. If we're repeating that bad language or that bad behaviour, and therefore it should absolutely follow a standard process of, poor behaviour.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think once you've done your duty as an employer that says, we're educating people on how to adapt and change their language in a world that's ever evolving. So rather than focus on what you can and can't say, we focus on a framework of using person-centered language, accepting that we make mistakes, that kind of stuff. If somebody's making the mistake over and over again, you've kind of moved past that and you're now into whether or not their behavior is in line with your company values, right?
It's no longer about language.
No, you're leaning back now on your company values and is their behavior acceptable or in line with your values? And I guess that's a different conversation.
Totally.
Okay, love that. Okay, good question. Whoever sent that in, it's got no name on that one. So question number 3, what should companies do if they operate in multiple regions where cultural norms and acceptable language may vary?
Oh, I love that.
Good question.
So I've actually handled a number of quite delicate situations around this. And if we think about some of the very, coming from a UK perspective, some of the words we would find particularly offensive in this country around the world are not. They translate as buddy or friend and are used in day-to-day language. What we have to do, my advice on language would be exactly the same as my advice on cultural adjustment in any other way, is that we have a overarching strategy of what our key sentiments are, and we have regional adjustments within those. But we have to be mindful of the base country that we're operating in. So again, if we are travelling to work or visit a different country, we need to be mindful of those language adjustments.
Yeah, love that. It's that designed globally, delivered locally piece, isn't it, around your strategy on this kind of stuff. And I guess that, one of the things that we do in our business, because we travel around the world, is we have batteries, don't we, for each country that we go to that says, so here are some of the cultural differences when you go to this country, but also here are some of the language things that might get you into trouble. So avoid them or, use these terms. So even in China, certain numbers and things are deemed as bad luck and, these kind of things. So those differences for each country we operate in, we have a battery of those so that if one of our colleagues is traveling there, they've got a bit of a guide before they go. And I think there is a bit of a individual responsibility to do some research anyway, but we try and provide that for our colleagues when they're traveling, right?
Absolutely.
It's a good one. Okay. Next question we have, there's one about pronouns, but I'm not going to do that because we're going to do a whole episode on pronouns in the future, right? Okay. So let's come back to that.
That'll be a joyful one.
That'll be a good one. Let's take a whole episode, sure. What are some common but less obvious examples of non-inclusive language that you see employees use? I think we've covered a bit of that with the "hey guys" and that kind of stuff, and then ethnic minorities and all of that kind of stuff that organizations have been using recently. But anything else that you think stands out for you?
Yeah, I mean, a recurring one that I hear is an email addressed to dear ladies.
I used to do that. I used to think it was endearing, and I don't anymore. But I did used to do that, right?
And I know a number of female colleagues who get very uncomfortable with that. And again, it's just that siloed language, isn't it?
Yeah, you mentioned one earlier on, which is like, the chairman, or, that kind of stuff, as opposed to just saying the chair.
Yeah.
Or, we still have policemen and it's police officer or firefighter and, post officer, these kind of things, these roles, which are, they're really heavily habitual, right? They've been around a really long time, and it was because historically it was men doing those roles, and the world has changed and it isn't anymore, and old habits die hard. And this is why I think we shouldn't over police this stuff, because those things do happen. A lot of the time it's not intentional, it's just old habits dying hard. And we've got to remember that most people don't wake up in the morning and think, I know I'm going to go and really upset my colleague today by calling them a policeman instead of a police officer. It isn't deliberate a lot of the time. It's just old habits die hard. That's not an excuse, and I'm not saying people should be allowed to continue to do that, but we do have to have a bit of tolerance here around old habits. Right? These things have been cultural norms in our country for a very long time, and we've got to accept that things take time to change.
Indeed.
Cool. Okay. Well, hopefully we've answered enough of your questions, and that gave you the answers you want. So as always, if you want to send us a question, you can send it to evan@metimer.global. That's his email address. Evan collates them. We don't get to see them until he hands us the envelope here. So don't be afraid to be really bold and really brave with your questions. I promise you, there's nothing we haven't already heard or seen before yet. So you may be able to surprise us. We're at that point, Dawn, where we're coming towards the end of the episode, and we are back with our recurring feature, Woke or Joke.
Ooh, good.
Exciting.
I've got a good one for you.
Oh, it's your turn, is it? Well, come on. You give me the woke or joke and I'll decide.
So, this is an organisation that's got multiple sites.
Right.
It's an office-based organisation, and their CEO, because they were very conscious of being open and transparent, took all of the doors off every office within their business to create an approachable environment.
As in physically removed the doors?
Physically removed all of the doors.
Oh. I want to say that's a joke, right? But part of me thinks it could be bloody true. I'm going to go with joke. It's a joke.
It is a joke. But
good. Thankfully, it is a joke.
Yeah, but I have heard organisations say to me, I remember a company telling me that they had an approachability hour every week. And at Thursday on a 3:00, if you'd got an issue, you could go and see the boss of the business with your gripe. So you'd got to walk down the centre of the office at 3:00 on a Thursday. Everybody knew what you were about to do.
Yeah.
But it was their approachability hour.
That's their approachability hour. I love that. I'll give that a go in our business. So in future episodes, we do this woke or joke, and it's where we challenge each other to answer whether a story is either a woke story or a joke story. And the person with the least amount of points at the end of season 1 will have to buy the other person dinner.
I'm loving the recommendations for dinner.
A bit ahead of me already, but we'll I'm sure I'll recover that before the end of the time. Okay, I think we're at the end of the episode, so it's bye from me.
And bye from me.
This episode is brought to you by Metimer, the online platform that measures inclusion. The Metimer platform moves beyond the DEI initiatives and allows businesses to measure the real-time impact on culture as well as their financial impact on their bottom line. The Metamer platform is a collaboration between data scientists, digital experts, and cultural change experts to bring substance to the topic of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's time for businesses to move past diversity quotas and start understanding the real impact and opportunities of an inclusive culture. To find out more, visit www.metamer.global.